Africa, as a younger person, I started to study African cosmology and African philosophical thought. I listened to Malcolm, and Malcolm said, "You left your mind in Africa," and I was trying to understand what that meant in a kind of recovery. And of course, over time, that was very important. So one of the things about African making that began to really get to me was, and my attraction to it, was that it was like music. It wasn't trapped in an attempt to create a specific moment in time in a kind of realism. And at that time, I was really involved in realism. But in the African context, you know, they live in the soup of themselves, so they don't have a black problem, because that's, you know, so they ain't thinking race. They thinking, what is the force I'm looking for? How can I get that force? And that force is connected to a kind of power, and that power is multidimensional. That is, that it doesn't operate in one stream. It's complete. And so in that way, I was looking at, okay, they designed this form takes space, and this form articulates itself in a certain way, and it always has an opening, like a form that operates to create a space. And I was taught that negative space was not as important as the positive space, but the African wasn't interested in that kind of shit. So immediately, I started for many years trying to understand that dynamic. And it took my going to Amsterdam and discovering this power in tulips and the history that was connected to it that shaped my sensibilities, so that when I understood in my African work, the African forms that I was collecting and dealing with, that this space was what I was really trying to understand. And at the time, I happened to be talking to Oliver about, this is in the 80s, I was talking to Oliver about, you know, and so he gave me this thing to read, that Heidegger. And, you know, first of all, I wasn't interested in Heidegger because I heard he was a Nazi. So I now know. And, you know, Oliver, like Ray, you know, I was looking at them tulips and I was trying to draw them, and I was, whoa. And Ray said, man, you can't draw that. Don't try to draw that, man. But I didn't pay attention, so I kept drawing them. And then I said, you know, he's right. And then a whole new world opened up. And when I was in there arguing with Oliver about space and time, we weren't arguing, we was having a conversation. And this idea of absence, whether a form is full or whether a form is empty, and what is creating that condition. Oh, that was, everything I was reading in African cosmology was already there. All that stuff I was reading in sacred science was there. So this is just another way of looking at something. And so the hoodies, these hoodies, you know, a cloak, you have to, like, we earlier, Oliver said something about garments, like the way you dress. See that the dressing, that what you put on yourself is a confrontation. Like those musicians, part of the reason they were so powerful is because they accommodated themselves in space taking. That is, they took space in a certain way. They made their body articulate. That articulation was exactly what I saw in those African sculptures. Hear this lean, this just subtle lean, and then you see mouths break a certain form, or Billy articulate herself against the microphone in a particular way. Those gestures really got to me, and I could see that blackness or black thought can emerge out of the sensibility that you bring to it. You don't need to have a black body. That's a trope that gets set into place to shape the way you move in the world. But then musicians, ain't nobody told James Brown to make black music. James Brown, the minute you hear that, now, what else you need? What else you need? Now that's why. Now that is the drum. Ha, boom. And the Temptations, same thing. Monk, bang. Down. That right there is where the sensibility is. So you don't need to have a black body. You don't need to have a black face trapped in time like a Hellenistic Greek form. So right there, I said, okay, I see my son wearing them hoodies just like I used to wear them Ben Davis pants so I could be cool when I was a kid. And here my son got a hoodie on, and he threw it up against the wall, and it looks like the person is in it. I look at it and I said, wait a minute. That's exactly the space that is taken, the form that is taken, the emptiness. What looks like emptiness is actually the point.
The void. Yeah.
There you go. And the void is the complete potentiality of space and time, and you have to step in it. And so the hoodies have no time. They have no space. They are an expression of the moment in space and time, and they are one thing, not one, two, or three things. They are one thing, and therefore they could operate in this broader context of my work, which was going to encompass these elements, of which the hoodies is only one expression. And that's why this idea of abstraction is a non-thing. Because everything I see up in here is abstract. I'm looking at all them people up in this audience. They're all abstract. None of them, except the individual aspect of their presencing. And we talked about presencing a great deal. But that's what African thought, African cosmology brought to me, and therefore it liberated me. I didn't have to. I painted murals because I wanted to make a statement to black people when I was a kid. But after that, I couldn't make the kind of murals I wanted to make because they wanted me to make black bodies. I'm not making black bodies anymore. I'm making stuff from my shit. I'm not interested in all that. So that's how that happened.
You know, I wish we would be able to get into both your murals and Joe Sam's murals and the response to the absence of black art within mainstream museums, which I believe was part of the radical response, right? Part of mural making and being commissioned to make murals was also about not being in major museums in that moment. But just to round this out, Oliver, since Dewey has already, teed you up, I want to think, he'll tee it up and then close us out. I want to think about your one specific body of work, which is an early body of work, the Sharpeville series, That for context, for those of you who may not remember, on March 21st in 1960, there was a massacre in South Africa. Police opened fire on an unseated crowd of black demonstrators who marched into Sharpeville's police station to protest that country system of colonial apartheid. 69 people were killed, 180 people were wounded. And this notion of time and space, you know, we've seen things like this happen through 2020. We've seen protests, we've seen people killed, we've seen all of this around racial apartheid, both in the US and South Africa, in London and Paris. And so, can you talk to us about the Sharpeville series, which I believe is 1966 through 77, and how we see that through line in your work today?
What you described, that was happening in South Africa was a mirror of what was happening in the United States. It was exactly the same. The governmental powers asserting their terrorism on a population that they wanted to control for economic reasons. So, one of the things about me using the South African mirror is I can get around Americana. Americana is always taking an event and making sure that it supports the cultural stance of the government. So, that stance in South Africa released me from having to deal with the American icons about race. Boring, because everyone is confined, as Dewey pointed out, to this rather narrow viewing of an event or fact or something. See? So I had to get around that because that's part of my bias too. I'm raised in this country. It's in this to look at. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Couldn't hear me before. I have to repeat all that. I don't even. Anyway, so that was very useful. The point for me was this: it is not unique in violent history that events of apartheid and persecution, lynching, terrorism, that's just not new for African people, Jewish people, German people, Irish people. Everybody's gone through it. But the spin, the Americana spin, the justification that you're trained to accept that Indians create massacres and we don't. We are innocent and they are the bad guys. Americana. Always setting up this rather simplistic good guys, bad guys, so European Americans who call themselves white can feel innocent of their acts. Now that justification is too much. Everybody's abused everybody else in the world, but that justification, how can you begin to have a dialogue when you are defining how I got to look at the event? See, it's difficult. So to avoid that, being trapped by it, one more example. We're supposed to believe that the Emancipation Proclamation is such a wonderful thing. It's wonderful in one sense only, that we don't have to pick as much cotton. But to take credit for it after that abuse is wrong. It was justice, God damn it. Emancipation should have been from the first day. We were trained to look at Lincoln as though he was a god who had suddenly saw the light. That was wrong. That was wrong. It wasn't just to start that mythos among black children and white children, the emancipator. Finally justice, damn it. Finally somebody fessed up a little bit. you understand what I'm saying? And I really mean this. That's Americana, and it's always that there is white supremacy in the country was started on that. I mean, please. This is not new. It just occurs in waves when everything is bad here. This shit comes up like, oh. And these European Americans, you call yourselves whites. Everybody else is an ethnic thing, but no, y'all white people. The minute you talk to each other, then you're English and Italian ethnic people. You see, the game is always afoot in the United States. Always euphemisms to cover up the event, just the straightness of it. We could get somewhere if we could just be just straight, no yeast, no hype. What did I learn about Native Americans? I'm spending time with this. We'll get to the Sharpeville thing. I went to school. Every film, school, the people were primitives. They weren't doing anything with the land. What bullshit? I mean, and I'm a kid. That's all I know. That's America. White people feel innocent of their history. Hell, who's innocent of their history? That goes for me. Black people commit genocide on black people. So, shit, can we tell the truth about it? For once, no. No, Hollow West was one. A few mistakes, my ass. No, think about it. Always being let down easy on acts, all human beings, that are terrific acts, cruel acts. Can you take it? You did it. So it's very difficult to deal inside with the events that were going on in the 60s, exactly the same things going on in South Africa, but I had some distance so I didn't fall prey to how I looked at the events, being separated, using that circumstance. And one of them was this. We all know the politics involved. They're obvious, apartheid, United States did. But the result for me was this. Those who were being persecuted in any group, what is the most sad thing for me is the desperateness that people suffer when they're being terrorized. And the example in the United States, we've been terrorized, and I do mean terrorized. I don't want no soft porn about them goddamn lynchings. That's pure terrorism that went on for that black people being driven out of whole communities. Why are we in the cities? We're driven out. Not kindly, you know. And all this is a myth. You can get this Americana like it didn't happen. It's too much. It's just too much. For me, too much. But what is behind it is a desperation that takes place. Whenever people are persecuted in this way, any group of people, what you see is a desperation. These people running, there's a desperation. And this is the beginning of course, a rebellion, but it's the desperation that a human being should never be put into. And above all, as a human being, always in this country, being designated by color, or anything but a human being.